In the summer of 1683, an enormous Ottoman army, possibly numbering over 150,000 men, stood at the gates of Vienna, poised to break into the heart of Europe. For the city's defenders, hopelessly outnumbered and cut off from aid, survival seemed impossible. For 2 agonizing months, Vienna was starved, bombarded, and tunneled beneath, pushed to the very edge of annihilation. But a fatal miscalculation by the Ottoman command and a desperate, last-ditch defense set the stage for one of history's most dramatic reversals. This is the story of how a city on the brink of destruction was saved by one of the largest and most decisive cavalry charges ever recorded. To understand the sheer terror that gripped Europe in 1683, you first have to understand the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a global superpower, a sprawling domain stretching from Arabia to North Africa and deep into the Balkans. For centuries, its expansion had been relentless. At its head was Sultan Mehmed IV, but its true ambition was wielded by one man, the Grand Vizier, Merzafonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa was a man of immense ambition. He was a skilled administrator and a devout man, but above all, he was a warrior. He saw himself as the heir to the legacy of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan who had first laid siege to Vienna over a century before. Where Suleiman had failed, Kara Mustafa was determined to succeed. He was convinced the Ottoman military machine was at its peak and that a fractured Europe, torn by religious and political rivalries, was ripe for the taking. The moment seemed perfect. In the spring of 1683, he got his sultan's blessing. An army of breathtaking scale was mobilized, a force with modern estimates ranging from 90,000 to around 140,000 men. At its core were the legendary Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, bred for war since childhood. They were supported by Sipahi heavy cavalry, provincial troops, and the fearsome Tatar horsemen of the Crimean Khanate, masters of the lightning raid. This was a mobile city of war. As it marched from Edirne, it cast a shadow over the land. Kara Mustafa bypassed smaller fortresses, his eyes fixed on the ultimate prize, Vienna, the imperial capital of his arch-rival, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. To take Vienna was to decapitate the Holy Roman Empire and hold a dagger to the throat of Christendom. For Kara Mustafa, this was more than strategy, it was destiny. He was sure the banner of the Prophet would soon fly from the spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral. The tide was coming in, and it seemed no one had the power to stop it. On July 14, 1683, the Ottoman host arrived, and the apocalypse began for Vienna. The city was a ghost of its former self. Emperor Leopold I had fled his capital, along with his court and tens of thousands of citizens. Left behind were the common people and a garrison that was catastrophically outnumbered. At the head of this desperate defense was Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man of iron will who would become the face of Viennese defiance. He commanded a total force of around 15,000 to 20,000, including regular soldiers and a citizen militia. Kara Mustafa began with a traditional demand for surrender. He offered terms, but Starhemberg's memory was fresh. Just days earlier, the nearby town of Perch-Tolsdorf had surrendered under similar promises, only for its people to be massacred. Starhemberg's reply was clear. He would fight to the last man. And so, the siege began. The Ottoman assault was a symphony of destruction. A crescent of trenches slowly choked the city. Batteries of heavy cannons roared day and night, smashing the city's fortifications. But the most terrifying weapon was invisible. Ottoman sappers, who were master miners, tunneled deep beneath the earth. Their goal was to pack the tunnels with black powder and literally blow the city walls apart from below. Life inside Vienna descended into a living nightmare. The constant thunder of cannons was the soundtrack to daily life. Food ran out, forcing people to eat cats, dogs, and rats. Disease stalked the streets, yet the defenders fought with a courage born of pure desperation. They launched daring raids into the Ottoman trenches and dug countermines, meeting the Ottoman sappers in claustrophobic, subterranean combat. For 2 long months, this brutal struggle continued. By early September, the situation was critical. The Great Walls were breached in several places. The defenders were exhausted, their numbers cut down by combat and sickness. Kara Mustafa, sensing victory, intensified the assaults, throwing the Janissaries at the breaches in relentless waves. Vienna was dying. It was no longer a question of if the city would fall, but when. Every prayer was for a relief that seemed would never come. While Vienna bled, the rest of Europe was paralyzed. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of states with their own agendas. The most powerful king in Europe, Louis XIV of France, was a bitter rival of the Habsburg Emperor Leopold. In a stunning display of realpolitik, he saw an opportunity in the crisis. It's debated how much he actively encouraged the attack, but he certainly offered no help, happy to see his Habsburg enemy weakened. The only real hope rested on a fragile pact, an alliance formalized just months before the siege. The treaty, often called the Treaty of Vienna, was a defensive pact between Emperor Leopold I and the King of Poland, John III Sobieski. The terms were simple. If the Ottomans attacked either Vienna or Krakow, the other would come to their aid. From the besieged city, desperate messengers risked their lives to slip through Ottoman lines. One of the most famous, whose story has since become a mix of fact and Viennese legend, was a man named Georg Franz Kolschitsky. He spoke Turkish and managed to move through the enemy camp, carrying urgent appeals for the relief army to hurry. These messages reached the scattered imperial forces under the command of Duke Charles of Lorraine, Emperor Leopold's brother-in-law. Charles was doing what he could, harassing Ottoman supply lines, but he knew he was no match for Kara Mustafa's main army. He could only wait. The burden of the treaty and the fate of Vienna now fell squarely on the shoulders of the King of Poland. The pleas that reached him from the Pope, Innocent XI, and from the Emperor himself were not just political requests. They were pleas to save Christendom. But the decision wasn't easy for Sobieski. His own nobles were wary. Marching the Polish army south would leave their own lands vulnerable. It was a monumental gamble. Saving Vienna could mean losing Poland. Yet Sobieski, a man of deep faith and a veteran of countless wars against the Ottomans, saw the bigger picture. He understood that Vienna was the linchpin. If it fell, Poland would be next. The plea had been answered. The Lion of Poland was coming. So who was this man upon whom the hopes of a continent now rested? John III. Sobieski was no ordinary king. Born in 1629, his entire life was a trial by fire, forged in the near-constant warfare that defined 17th century Poland. He had fought Cossacks, Tatars, Swedes, and, most importantly, the Ottoman Turks. This wasn't his first rodeo. A decade earlier, at the Battle of Khotin, his brilliant leadership had led to the annihilation of an Ottoman army, a victory that got him elected to the Polish throne. His subjects adored him. The Ottomans themselves had a name for him, the Lion of Liechtenstein, a term of respect for a feared opponent. Now, at 64 years old, an age when most commanders would be long retired, he was preparing to lead the most critical campaign of his life. Honoring his commitment, Sobieski issued the call to arms. By August, he had assembled a force of about 23,000 men. The crown jewel of this army was a contingent of roughly 3,000 elite heavy cavalry, the Hussaria, the legendary Winged Hussars. These weren't just soldiers. They were the pinnacle of Polish military might. On August 15th, Sobieski led his army south from Krakow on a grueling march. The journey was a race against time. He knew he couldn't face the Ottoman army alone. The plan was to link up with the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrians under Charles of Lorraine, and various German contingents. Sobieski was leaving the safety of his kingdom, marching into the heart of the conflict, and taking supreme command of a multinational, multilingual coalition. Everything depended on his leadership. The fate of the West rested on his aging shoulders. The army that gathered to save Vienna was a testament to the terror the Ottoman advance inspired. It was a coalition of the desperate, a mosaic of languages and uniforms united by a common threat. This was the Christian coalition, forged in the face of an existential crisis. The Allied army consisted of three main groups. First were the imperial troops of the Holy Roman Empire, mostly Austrians, under the steady command of Duke Charles of Lorraine. Then came powerful contingents from German states like Saxony and Bavaria. Finally, there were the Poles under King John III Sobieski. Though their numbers were smaller, they brought their king, who by treaty and reputation was given overall command, and of course, their legendary Winged Hussars. All told, the relief army numbered somewhere around 70,000 men, a formidable force, but still likely outnumbered by Kara Mustafa's besieging army. Uniting an army like this was a diplomatic headache. These were states that had often been rivals. The agreement that put a Polish king in command of German and Austrian princes was fragile, built on Sobieski's immense personal prestige. The logistics were a nightmare. But there was one clause in their agreement that would become important later. King Sobieski and his Polish troops were granted the first rights to plunder the enemy camp if they won. Against all odds, the alliance held. United by Sobieski's leadership, the disparate armies began to move as one. They were no longer just Poles, Austrians, and Germans. They were the last hope of Vienna. Their plan was daring, risky, and hinged entirely on the element of surprise. Kara Mustafa wasn't a fool. He knew a relief army was coming, but he made a series of catastrophic miscalculations, rooted in arrogance. He'd entrusted the defense of his rear to the Crimean Khan, but for various reasons, including a strained relationship between the two commanders, the Tatar reconnaissance of the area was poor. More critically, Kara Mustafa was obsessed with taking Vienna, so tantalizingly close to victory that he devoted his best troops to the final assaults on the city, not to preparing for a battle in the open field. His greatest error, however, was one of geography. To the northwest of Vienna lay a series of steep, densely forested hills known as the Wienerwald, the Vienna Woods. The centerpiece of this terrain was the Kahlenberg, a prominent hill offering a commanding view of the city and the Ottoman camp below. Kara Mustafa and his engineers considered the dense, hilly terrain too difficult for a large army to cross quickly, especially with artillery. He left the area almost completely unguarded, convinced no major attack could possibly come from that direction. This was precisely the route Sobieski and Charles of Lorraine chose. On September 6th, the Allied army crossed the Danube River at Thun. From there, they vanished into the Vienna woods. For several days, the massive army of nearly 70,000 men crept through the dense forest, shielded from Ottoman scouts. It was a Herculean effort. Sappers worked tirelessly, clearing paths and physically hauling heavy cannons up the steep slopes with ropes, and they remained undetected. By the evening of September 11th, the Christian army had done the impossible. They stood atop the Kahlenberg and the surrounding hills, arrayed for battle. Below them, spread out like a map, lay the sprawling Ottoman camp, its back completely exposed. As the sun set, the Christian soldiers lit signal fires, a prearranged sign to the desperate defenders that help had finally arrived. Imagine the sight for Starhemberg and his starving garrison. After 2 months of hell, seeing the hills ablaze with the campfires of a massive army, hope was reborn. Kara Mustafa was stunned. He had been completely outmaneuvered. He hastily tried to redeploy his forces, but it was too late. His army was caught between the hammer of the relief force on the hills and the anvil of the Viennese garrison. The battle for Vienna would begin at dawn. As the sun rose on September 12, 1683, the battle for Vienna began. This wasn't a single, dramatic charge. Not yet. This was a slow, grinding, brutal advance. The Ottoman forces, caught off guard, scrambled to face the threat descending from the Kahlenberg. The battle unfolded across a wide front. On the Allied left, forces under Charles of Lorraine began their methodical push, fighting through vineyards and villages in vicious, close-quarters combat. In the center, the German contingents pushed forward, their advance a bloody struggle against entrenched Ottoman positions. The Ottomans fought with their customary ferocity, launching disciplined counterattacks that stalled the Allied advance. Kara Mustafa remained convinced he could break the city's defenses before the battle in his rear was decided. In a desperate gamble, his miners even attempted to detonate their last massive mines under the city walls during the battle, but vigilant defenders found and neutralized them. For over 12 hours, from dawn until late afternoon, the battle raged. It was a soldier's fight, a bloody affair of musketry and artillery duels. The Allied advance was slow, measured in yards won at the cost of blood. The Ottoman lines bent, but they didn't break. By late afternoon, the Allied forces were exhausted. The fate of the battle hung precariously in the balance, but Sobieski had been holding his own trump card. Positioned on the right flank, on the highest ground, he had kept the bulk of his cavalry in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment. The Ottomans were tired, their formations stretched and disorganized. The moment had arrived. Before we get to the final act, we need to understand the weapon that Sobieski was about to unleash. This wasn't just cavalry. This was the Hussaria, the Winged Hussars of Poland. For nearly 2 centuries, they were arguably the most formidable shock cavalry in the world. These were the elite. Their primary weapon was the kopia, an incredibly long lance, often between 15 and 20 feet in length. It was hollowed out to be lighter, but designed for one purpose: to shatter enemy formations on the first charge. After the lance broke on impact, the hussar would draw his curved saber, the sabla, and continue the fight. They were clad in polished steel armor and often wore the skins of leopards over their shoulders, adding to their fearsome appearance. And then there were the wings. These iconic wooden frames, adorned with eagle feathers, were mounted to the back of their armor or saddle. The exact purpose of these wings is still debated by historians. They were certainly an intimidating spectacle. Some argue their primary purpose was psychological, creating a terrifying rushing sound as they charged, while others believe this effect is exaggerated and their role was more symbolic. Whatever their purpose, they were an instrument of psychological warfare. Their tactics were simple and devastating: a charge that accelerated into an unstoppable gallop, hitting the enemy line like a thunderbolt. Their reputation was legendary, and on September 12, 1683, they were poised on the high ground, looking down upon an exhausted Ottoman army. Sobieski had held them back all day. Now, he would finally let them fly. The time was around 5 p.m. The battle had raged for nearly a full day. John III Sobieski, positioned on the high ground, saw his moment. He gave the order. Across a front several kilometers wide, what is often called the largest cavalry charge in history, began to move. About 18,000 horsemen, a combined force of Polish and Imperial German cavalry, crested the hill and began their descent. At the very tip of the spear, leading his 3,000 elite Winged Hussars, was the 64-year-old king himself. Imagine the sight. Imagine the sound. 18,000 heavy cavalry thundering down the slopes. The setting sun glinted off thousands of steel helmets. The great feathered wings of the hussars roared and fluttered. The ground itself trembled under the impact of tens of thousands of hooves. For the exhausted Ottoman soldiers, it must have looked like the wrath of God descending upon them. They had been fighting infantry all day, and now an army of what looked like armored angels of death was charging directly into their exposed flank. The impact was cataclysmic. The charge was irresistible, a wave of unstoppable force that broke everything in its path. It crashed through the Ottoman camp, overrunning artillery and sweeping aside any unit that tried to stand against it. The charge cut straight towards the heart of the Ottoman command, the lavish red tent of the Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. Panic took hold. The Ottoman lines, which had held firm for hours, simply dissolved. What had been an army moments before was now a terrified mob. Kara Mustafa himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing the field in such haste that he left his entire command post behind. As the cavalry rampaged through the camp, the Viennese garrison sallied out from the city, attacking the disintegrating Ottoman lines from the other side. The battle was over. One of the largest cavalry charges in history hadn't just broken the Ottoman army, it had shattered it as a coherent fighting force. As dusk fell, the scene was one of surreal triumph. The once mighty Ottoman army had disintegrated, its soldiers scattered in a panicked rout. The Allied army was in possession of the field, the city, and the sprawling, abandoned Ottoman camp. King John III Sobieski surveyed the scene of his monumental victory. He famously sent a message to the Pope, paraphrasing Julius Caesar with a humble twist: Venemus, vidimus, Deus vicit. We came, we saw, God conquered. The spoils of war were beyond imagination. The Ottoman army, expecting to sack one of Europe's wealthiest cities, had brought its own considerable treasure with it. According to the treaty, Sobieski and his Poles had first rights to the plunder. For the citizens of Vienna, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. After 2 months of starvation and terror, they were free. But the cost was staggering. It's estimated that the garrison and civilian population had lost a huge portion of their numbers during the brutal siege. The fate of the vanquished commander was grim. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa managed to escape the battlefield, but he could not escape the Sultan's wrath. For his catastrophic failure, he was condemned. On December 25, 1683, in Belgrade, by order of Sultan Mehmed IV, Kara Mustafa was executed by strangulation with a silken cord. His dream of conquering Vienna had ended in his own disgrace and death. The gateway to Europe remained closed. The victory at Vienna was more than just the relief of a single city. It was the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Never again would an Ottoman army threaten the heart of the continent. The psychological impact was immense. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered on the slopes of the Kahlenberg. In the wake of the victory, Pope Innocent XI formalized the creation of a new, invigorated Holy League. This alliance, consisting of the Holy Roman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Republic of Venice, with Russia joining later, was formed not just for defense, but for offense. The momentum had shifted. What followed was the Great Turkish War, a 16-year conflict where the Holy League systematically pushed the Ottomans back. The Habsburgs reconquered almost all of Hungary. The tide of centuries had finally turned. The war culminated in 1699 with the Treaty of Karlowitz. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire was forced to formally cede vast territories in Europe. This marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long, slow decline as a major European power, a process that would eventually earn it the name the Sick Man of Europe over a century later. The charge led by John III Sobieski didn't just save a city, it reversed the course of a centuries-long conflict. It marked the moment when Europe stopped defending and started advancing. The echo of those hooves thundering down the Kahlenberg would resonate through history. In the grand tapestry of history, there are moments where the fate of generations is decided in a handful of desperate hours. September 12, 1683, was one of those moments. The story of the Siege of Vienna is a story of extremes, the depths of desperation inside the city and the heights of heroism on the Kahlenberg Hills. It's the story of an ambitious vizier whose dream of conquest turned into a nightmare. And it's the story of an aging Polish king who honored his word, united a continent, and led from the front in one of the most spectacular moments in military history. The charge of the Winged Hussars was more than a military maneuver. It was a symbol. It was the moment a fractured Europe finally found the unity and courage to stand against a power that had seemed unstoppable. It was a victory so decisive that it didn't just end a battle, it ended an era. The Western world as we know it was shaped by the outcome of that day. It stands as a powerful reminder that history is never a foregone conclusion, and that sometimes the future really can be saved by a single heroic charge.